that somebody might get away with murder.
It's very unfortunate that we have any cold cases at all, and certainly unfortunate that we have as many as we do. And that's why Ryan's work and the work of Project Cold Case is so important.
Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Ryan Backman, founder and executive director of Project Cold Case, and my guest today is Lorena Inclan,
Hey,
Action News.
Very
familiar face. We realized the other day that I do this every time I introduce somebody. So
hopefully everybody knows me by now.
By now they should know you. We typically do a case. We pick a case and we go back through one that you've done on Action News Jax and podcast. We show a clip, but we get lots of questions about media and families wanting to participate with the media, being intimidated by the media, not really knowing how to reach out to the media and the best way to do that. And you and I have a long history. We do. And we've known each other for a long time. And
like almost 10 years or something. It's crazy.
It's long. And I've always just been, it's crazy to me what you do as a reporter, as a journalist, and the stuff that I don't feel like a lot of people understand. I don't understand a lot of other jobs. And without knowing you, I wouldn't have that behind the scenes kind of glimpse. So I thought this is the perfect opportunity to talk to you a little bit about what it's like to be a journalist. I can talk a little bit about what it's like to be a survivor, that's lost somebody and dealt with the media in a very tough time, and then over the years since, and now have become friendly with a number of journalists out there. So,
and it's a trust factor.
It is a trust factor.
It's huge.
It's a big deal, and you don't have the option always of slow building trust.
No, I don't.
You don't have that at all.
A lot of times it's like, cold calling somebody. Hey, you don't know who I am. You don't know my name. You don't know anything about me, but I need to talk to you.
Right.
And it's tough, It's really tough because I don't ever want to. If I were in that person's shoes, I'd be like, who are you? Why are you calling me? Like, I don't want to talk to you. You know what I mean?
And it's so, I have seen the families that say, I can't talk right now, or I don't want to talk right now. But the media, the news is a constantly changing thing. And like 3 weeks later, or 3 months later, when you have decided, okay, all of a sudden my loved one's no longer being talked about at all, I want to reach back out. And then the media has moved on because there's been so many other stories going on. And
it's a sad thing. I mean, that's when everybody's talking about that case, and that's the toughest time for family members to talk.
It is. It is. And I've learned that if you can give a little, then you don't have to give a lot. But if you can give a little, then obviously we don't want these cases to drag out for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. But when you've developed a relationship with the media, then when 10 years does hit, you have those contacts and you hopefully have that trust. But in the very beginning, it's tough to know which reporters are in it for the right reasons. There are, there's cases where somebody's trying to make a name for themselves and
that happens.
Can be a little forward or a little invasive. I mean, we've all seen it happen. But I wanted to talk to you, I want to know, well, first, let me start at the beginning. Why did you want to become a journalist?
So that's a great question. I've been in the business now for 10 years. I started behind the scenes at a station down in Miami, which is my hometown. And I was doing what we call studio tech work, which is in the studio, making sure the talent is looking at the right camera and all that. And then from there, I transitioned to on-air. And my first on-air job was in Amarillo, Texas. Super far away.
So
for a
did
Miami
you go
girl.
to school to be?
I did.
Yeah.
I went to the University of Miami and I studied. Yes, right. I threw up the U over there. Thank you, Clint. Appreciate it. That's right. My poor Kane's not doing very well. Hopefully it gets better. But so I studied broadcast journalism at UM. But the reason I got into journalism, so my family comes from Cuba. Right. And as you know, in Cuba, there's no freedom of the press.
Right.
And it's unfortunate all the things that go on in that country and in other countries where they can't enjoy the freedom of the press, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and it's not a place where you want to live. And so I take it very seriously because of my family heritage, but also I grew up in a household where watching the news was a daily occurrence. Like we would sit around and we would watch el noticiero, the news in Spanish. And I admired the people who were giving me information, and it's definitely a trust thing. I mean, if you feel like you can trust the person who's giving you information, then that person becomes a very integral part of your life. Because when something big happens, whether it's a hurricane or big breaking news, who are you going to turn to for perspective, for background? Is the person who you've been watching, most of your life, and who's been accurate. And you know what? Here's the thing: when you're not accurate and something happens, and you make a mistake, because we're human, it's how you respond to it that makes a difference. You have to own up to it.
Well, and it's true, because I mean, anchors, reporters become a part of our families at home. We feel like we know you because we see you every single day on the news, and you become local celebrities. I mean, because everybody knows who you are. They see you on TV. You guys typically do a lot of charity work. You give back a lot. I mean, I know Action News Jax has a huge donation drive was going on this morning for the Bahamas and the devastation from Hurricane Dorian. And you're committed to this community. The station is committed to this community. The reporters and journalists are committed to this community. And when you are sitting at home on the couch, that's who you see. That's who you turn to find out. Do I need to evacuate with a storm? What happened down the street where I saw all the police cars? And it really does become, it's weird, but you feel like somebody that you see on TV every day, even when you don't know them.
Absolutely. And then if you feel like they're being truthful and honest with you, then that is a relationship that is, for us as journalists, our credibility is everything. And if we don't have that, then we don't have anything. So but at the same time, as I mentioned, we're human. We do make mistakes. I mean, none of us are perfect. We try to get as close as possible to what the truth is, and for that we need to speak with people in the community. We need to speak with people like you who are experts in their field. We don't go into covering a story knowing everything about the story. We have to garner that information from people who are close to the event, which is why in this case, when a cold case happens, or let's say it's a murder that just happened, of course we want to talk to the family. I mean, those are the people closest to the victim. And I cringe every single time I have to go and speak to a mother who just lost their child. I mean, that's not something that I enjoy doing at all. In fact, when I go and have to knock on a door, the first thing I say is, I am so sorry that I'm here. I don't want to bother you. This is not, and I even say, this is the part of my job that I hate the most. I really, it gives me anxiety too. I don't like it. So I totally understand when they slam the door in my face. I get it. Like, if I were in their shoes, I probably would do the same thing. So I just try to be very, very empathetic, because I don't want to be in their shoes, obviously, ever. And I would hope that if I ever am the person who is, on the other side, is understanding. So I come with that perspective. And at that moment, a lot of people don't want to talk to me, which is understandable. But I'm always very just humbled when somebody does sort of, I guess, let their guard down a little bit and does open up. Because that is, for me as a journalist, I wouldn't be able to tell the story without that perspective. So I am so thankful when they do open up.
Yeah, and you do such a great job of it. And I know, to the families that are out there that are wondering and considering reaching out to their local news station or whatever, I've always found the reporters that don't do a great job, that aren't very empathetic and don't show any sympathy, they tend to bounce from station to station pretty quickly. If you recognize the person at your door,
you've seen them before,
you've seen them do a bunch of stories, they typically have to have a rapport with people, or they're going to have to move on.
Exactly. And to not that a reporter being abrasive or being too aggressive is a good thing at all, but I do want to give people a perspective of what that reporter is faced with back at the station. There is an enormous amount of pressure from our managers, from not just in the newsroom, but competition in the market, to get the interview.
Well, if you turn and walk away and the next station comes up and gets the interview because they knocked a little longer, banged a little harder,
or
whatever, a
little
little bit more persistent.
And that's would be terrible for a person's career. You know?
And I want to show another perspective too. Your job is not to only do investigative reporting on murders or like. So there are times where being a little bit invasive is actually for the public good. Maybe not with murder victims and their families, but if you've got a corrupt politician,
then you want me to put a mic in their face and try to get some sort of reaction.
Want those answers. So
absolutely.
You're in a tough position because you have to do that. You don't know, like you said earlier, you don't know what that story is going to be when you walk in that day. And I want to talk a little bit about that. I was telling you, on my way in today, I knew everything that I had to do today. Of course, there's always stuff that comes up. I know what I got to get done tomorrow and the rest of the week. I've got my list. But your job is, tomorrow morning you're going to show up at the station and you're going to have a little meeting and they're going to tell you, this is what you're covering. This is what's news today.
Right. You can have a day planned out. Yeah. And that'll go out the door as soon as they assign stories.
And they're going to tell you, by the way, this is what you're covering and we need it for 5:15.
Right. Correct.
So you have to go interview this person, this person, this person. You have to do those cold calls, find somebody that's willing to talk to you.
Right.
To explain what's going on to you.
And not only that story, but a lot of times we have two separate stories that we're doing that day. So our deadlines are even tighter because you have to finish your earlier stories that air earlier in the day so you can get started on that second story that airs in another newscast.
Right.
So we barely have time to eat a snack.
Yeah.
And it is just go the whole time. And as you said, I will come into the morning meeting and I'll have story ideas to pitch in the morning meeting, but I have no idea what the managers will want me to do. Yeah. I mean, I kind of have it. I've been there for almost 7 years, and I kind of know what we want to cover.
You knew last week was going to be Dorian all day, every day.
Throttle. Yes, exactly.
But
so I pitched Dorian
thankfully,
stories.
we don't have hurricanes every week. So,
thank God. Yes.
But that means that you don't know somebody's going to come in and there's a cargo ship that's sinking.
So that is definitely huge news this week as well. So we're going to be following up on that, and a lot of times too, my husband even he's funny because I've been in the business for a long time, but sometimes he'll ask me, "Oh, what are you doing tomorrow?" I'm like, what? I have no idea. I'm like, I'm going to work. All I know is that I'm going to work. And he's like, oh, because I wanted to know if you were going to be on a server. I'm like, I have no idea. Yeah. I could be either in Clay County or in St. Johns County or who knows where I'll be.
I know because I get those calls from you occasionally where you're like, hey, I'm doing something and I'd like to get a quote from you.
Right.
And I mean, we go back to where, I mean, you've interviewed me in other offices. You've interviewed me at my house.
Yes.
One time we met at Moe's. I had my daughter with me, and I pushed her over in the stroller off to the side,
I remember that. Yeah, anywhere. We'll go wherever you are, wherever we can get the interview. And I feel, and thank you so much for being so understanding, because sometimes I'll call you the day of and be like, can you squeeze me in for like 10 minutes? Because,
I know, and sometimes I'm out of town, or sometimes I'm home with a sick kid, and I'm like, oh,
yeah, no, and it's tough. A lot of people will be like, well, if you would have told me yesterday, I'm like, if I knew that I was going to do this story yesterday, trust me, I would have let you know.
And we talked about it. One of your fellow journalists sent me an email this morning about a story, and I wasn't even in the office yet, and I called on the way in because I know, like, working everybody's timing is difficult, and luckily
you're a pro now,
and I try to take that into consideration, and luckily her story is not a day turn. So she said, can I call you this afternoon? I'm doing the drive for the Bahamas. And I said, that's fine. I was like, that's
you even
rare,
know the lingo, day turn. Day turn means that it's airing that day.
Well, I have been lucky enough to get a behind the scenes glimpse. We have some pictures because a lot of times we do when you come and do the stories, we take some pictures of what's going on. We've been in your studio. There's Detective Ray Reeves.
All that lighting takes time to set up.
All that light. But these were some that we did at your studio, but we have some that was in Jax Beach.
That's right.
We did a story there. So you have to set up your lighting.
And it takes time to gather
basically,
that. Yeah, it was tiny.
It was a tight squeeze in that one.
Yep.
That's when you got the award. There's you and your husband and Rich Commando on our board. That was for the Child Advocacy Award.
Thank you so much for nominating me.
That was great. That's here in our office, in our big conference room. But your camera guys, Joel,
Yes.
That's not him in that
That's DR.
picture.
Joel
but
also does a
Joel
lot of-
has
yep.
done a lot. Like,
Yeah.
we go way back. He's
we
come
do,
to my
yeah.
house. He's
Yeah, that's right. He knows.
He
Yeah,
was
he knows you very well.
We have
too.
that. I don't know if we put that picture in there. There's a picture of you, me, Joel, and May. When she was a baby, and this organization was being run out of my upstairs office, and my mom had to come over and watch May so I could do an interview.
That's true.
You.
I need to go find that story. I remember that story. It was one of the first stories we did.
Yeah.
Yep.
There's Sergeant Dan Jansen and I. Yeah, that's what the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office.
That day was super. That was like a 3-hour
that was a
interview.
Yeah, we sat together. We did and we're behind the scenes. Like I said, Joel's been to my house. His wife works at the station as well, right? And she does.
Yep.
There's so much that goes on behind the scenes.
Correct.
We always see you, but you come and get this footage, and then y'all always have to rush back to the studio then to actually edit it and get it into.
It's a very long process. To edit a 1 minute and 10-second story takes a solid 40-45 minutes. Think about that. So 1 minute and 10-15 seconds takes my editor, my photographer, or whoever I'm working with, about 40 solid minutes to put it together. And so imagine if it was something longer. So if it's a longer piece, 2-3 minutes more, it could take more than an hour, 2 hours.
And this is something that's important for families to know, because we talked to a family one time that it wasn't your story or even locally, but they couldn't understand why the 1 hour interview they did
we get that question a lot.
Was edited down. Their portion of the story was only 20 seconds or something,
right?
And they were frustrated with that. But that's on a and I don't know the lingo for this, but on a normal day's news segment. The stories are 60 seconds, 70 seconds.
Correct.
That's it.
We only get a little bit more than a minute to tell the story. Now, if it's a story that's very involved and there are more things, I can call my manager and say, hey, can you give me more time?
Right.
Because here's the thing, I'm not the only reporter in the newscast.
Sure.
There are other reporters who have stories.
What you're covering is not the only thing going on that day.
It's not the only thing going on. And they have to be able to fit everybody in. They have to be able to tell the viewer everything that's going on in our community, not just one story. And for me, that one story is super important, but for the producer, that story signifies maybe like a minute and a half for their show. They need to fill the rest of that show with other things. And
the typical, so y'all have, how long is a broadcast? Like you have there's so much news now. You have the 5 o'clock. Does that go to 5:30 or does that go to 6?
We have our news cycle is basically, so we have the 5 o'clock show that in the evening. Well, let me start at the beginning. We have a morning show,
right? And
that starts at 4:30 in the morning till 9.
And you do those on the weekends.
On the weekend, yes. But that show actually starts at 6.
Weekend. Okay, yeah. You just have to get up at 4:30.
I just have to get up at 4 to get ready and everything. But so during the week, it's 4:30 in the morning till 9, and then there's a little bit of there's programming between 9 and noon. Noon is our next newscast, and then 5 o'clock, 5:30, 6, 6:30.
Yeah.
And then there's a 10. 10:30 and 11.
Yeah, and even though they run consistent, like it starts at 5 and ends at 6:30 or 7.
Right. So
but those are different segments. I mean, you guys switch in and out.
And we have
stories.
Different viewers in different what we call day parts. Like
5 o'clock. I'm never home at 5 o'clock, so I never catch the 5 o'clock.
Right.
News.
Right. And there's a lot of research that goes into so who are our viewers at certain times, and we try to cater our stories to, every station in the country does that kind of research, just because you want to be able to, you want to know who you're
targeting an audience.
Right, exactly. So that we do stories that really interest them.
Yeah. What else? There's some other. Do you remember the first murder you covered?
Ooh.
I should have let
that's a tough one. I mean, I remember a big sort of high profile stories. That one of the first big stories that one of the first big murders that I ever covered was the Shelby Farrow murder.
Yeah.
And I remember I was pretty brand new. I had only been here maybe a few months, and I was working the weekends, and that really was, I had never really covered such a large crime scene before. I came from a station in Orlando where I didn't really get to go live that much. I didn't really go to crime scenes that much. So it was startling to really see. And Shelby was really loved in the community. She had so many friends. There were so many people at that crime scene. Her family, her mom was there, her friends. and it was
Yeah.
it was tough to be the person who goes up to grieving people and say, essentially, can you share your grief with me on camera?
Yeah.
It's so difficult.
And but you didn't know how loved she was. For those that don't know the Shelby Ferris story, she was a manager at a Metro PCS store.
Right.
And
on Main Street.
Yeah, on Main Street here in Jacksonville, 20 years old, 21. And she was young, and a guy comes in, robs the store, gets the money, and then shoots her anyway. And it was all caught on camera.
Right.
And they caught the guy pretty quickly, within a couple of days. And
it was horrible.
It was horrible. She had worked on the mayor's campaign at that time. The mayor that time, she had. She
was a cheerleader, and she was really loved. And
taught cheerleading. She, was the support system for her family. They all looked to her and loved her. I mean, she was really well loved in the community, and that one was.
And that was a crazy month, because I believe a couple of days later, within days of each other, we had another really high profile case Amber Bass, and which that remains unsolved.
Yeah.
So we had back-to-back young women,
very young,
who were robbed,
pretty women that were robbed and shot, and both killed. Yeah, I mean,
and I remember meeting Amber's family as well, and her sister especially, who's always been so gracious and
Robin's
speaking
great.
with us.
Yeah. And you've developed relationships with them.
I have.
You've developed some of our other families.
And it's important for them to know that I'm here. I don't plan on going anywhere. This is my home as well.
Yeah.
So whatever the crime that happens here affects me as well. I mean, this is my home, and I really enjoy being in a market. I've been here in Jacksonville almost 7 years now. In my previous markets, I had only been there like a year and a half or so. I mean, it wasn't a, it was sort of a stepping stone for me.
Right.
Amarillo, I love Amarillo. I will always have a sweet spot for Amarillo, but it wasn't a place where I would, was trying to settle down.
That wasn't going to be the last stop on
the. Right, exactly. And so I really love Jacksonville and the communities around it too. So, and I hope that translates when I speak with families.
Oh, I know it does. I mean, that's why, we started a partnership with your station. I mean, you're on our board of directors. Like, we have done countless stories together, and I've been able to call you when a family, was desperate for some attention. And you've called me when you were looking for, stories like that to do. And it was a natural fit that we could partner and create a series for Action News Jax. And we did that. You have podcasts, you have these stories that you do. And I think, it's easy for anybody watching this, if you're in Jacksonville or in the surrounding areas, to contact Lorena. I mean, you have kind of become the face, for telling these stories and making sure that people are cared about, that they know that there's a bond there, and trust that you're not going to do anything, to jeopardize that.
These are difficult stories to tell too. I mean, these are the darkest moments for families.
And I remember the day after my dad was murdered, my wife went over to the neighbor and was like, just in case media shows up, we don't want you wondering why. This is what happened. And we got in the car and we drove down to my dad's house, and his common law wife, we just called, them married, but they've been together for 24 years. We went down to see her, and on our way, she called and she said, I just want you to know there's a reporter in the front yard. She said, he's been very nice. I can't talk to him. I don't want to talk to him. But, and you don't have to, but if you want to, you can. And so when we got there, he introduced himself. I introduced myself. He asked if I, had anything I wanted to ask or say. And I told him, well, maybe, but right now my priority is getting in and seeing Jane and, being with family. And he said, I completely understand. He said, as long as you guys don't mind, I'm going to hang out here for a little while. If you want to come back out and talk to me at any point, I'm here. And
he handled that the right way.
And he did. Yeah. And so, like, I don't know, an hour later, maybe more, I walk by the window and I look out and he's sitting out there in the driveway. And I was like, gosh, this guy has not bothered us. He hasn't knocked on the door. He hasn't harassed us. I'm like, I'm going to go out there, and talk to him. And we did. And then we finished up, and he turned, got in his car and was leaving, and a news station was pulling up, and they jumped out with the cameras, and it was like, oh.
No, that's not the right way to
Yeah,
go.
and we just turned around and walked in, and it was like,
Right.
it was like the two, we saw both sides right then and there.
Right, exactly.
Like the way to do it and the way not to do it. And there are local reporters that I won't take calls from, it's just because of how they have, I've seen them, treat people. There's not very many, especially locally, but
it's one of those things you'll really only get one shot,
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, and it's first impressions are everything.
And I get I feel like that's a good point, and you kind of see that they're, this is real life. Like this this story may be their only moment on TV, but they're going to live with this, whether it's solved, unsolved, for the rest of their lives. And you treat those families like that. Like this is not just, a 1 minute segment for me. And I think that's the difference. You can tell when somebody's, I've never done a story about my dad or about a murder, but I've done stories about other things where people are completely checked out. The reporters are completely checked out, and they're like,
and you can tell, right?
When
they're in the interview,
right
they're
away,
just thinking about what they're doing next.
they have no interest in what we're talking about. They're looking around, they're on their phone, because sometimes they get to just ask the question, and
Right.
So,
but if they're not engaged, then why would you want to open up to them?
Right. And so, for me, those are, I just remember that. And I'm like, next time you call and you want to talk about something, I'm not going to be available.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And that is your right. And you shouldn't be. I mean, this is a very personal interview. Yeah. You're not talking about the weather. You're talking about something very, very personal, and you should only share it with somebody who you trust, somebody who you're trusting me with telling your loved one's story. Right. This is what's going to be out there in the world, in the internet. I mean, these stories live on forever. I mean,
they do.
You Google your loved one's name, and my story will come up.
Right.
And that I take very seriously. I want to be able to do that story justice. And tell the right story.
We learned this with a case you did, and I think we have some pictures that the George Schwinder case.
Yes.
In your station, we met there, and we learned this. There it is. There's George's daughters, and they asked the question. We don't understand why anytime we Google our dad's name, nothing shows up. Well,
that gives me chills talking about it.
It does. It was 1971 case, I believe, and
they were little girls.
Look at all the newspapers that they put.
Yep.
So that stuff is not always available online. Not every newspaper goes and archives their stuff, and certainly no television media has gone back through all their archives and made them available online.
Right.
So this was a service that we didn't actually know that we were doing until they asked that question. But we are creating stories that didn't live on the internet.
Exactly.
They weren't in existence for anyone else to see. And if anybody had ever Googled George Schwinder before you did that story and said, I have information on George Schwinder, I'm going to Google his name and find out if that case was solved.
Right.
There would have been nothing.
No information whatsoever.
But after that story, now all of a sudden, if anybody ever has information or wants to know about that case,
and it's interesting.
It lives forever.
Yes, because I didn't realize that we were also doing that for families
Right.
until they asked the question. I'm like, oh yeah, this will be Googleable.
Yeah, we are creating archives of these cases. And look, if something happened from the late 90s, early 2000s till now, there's a good chance you'll find it on the internet.
There's a good chance.
But anything that happened, prior to that, somebody has to have physically gone in and put it on the internet to make sure that people could see it. And so, when we look back at these cases and it's like, well, what kind of services do you offer? That was never a thought like, well, we're actually creating this story on the internet.
We're sort of bringing it to today's standards. Because if you're not on the internet, I mean, the reality is if you can't Google something, a lot of people...
It doesn't exist.
A lot of people are, exactly. A lot of people are not going to go to the library and sit through a bunch of newspapers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially if, let's say, hopefully this is a person who might have a tip. Are they really going to go out of their way and to the nearest library? I mean, they want to Google it,
Yeah, exactly.
So it's very, very important.
And it was obviously important to the Schwinder family because they are the ones that brought it up. We just never understood why we couldn't Google it and find out. Well, now
I'm
can.
so thankful they can. And unfortunately, their case remains unsolved. But, at least, people can Google their dad's name now. And his story will come up.
Remember you asking them in that... interview, like, do you worry about your dad, being forgotten? And they kind of said, I mean, not really, but yes, like, I guess at a certain point we all are forgotten. You know what I mean? Like, if they don't keep that going to their children, who were, by the way, not alive when their grandfather was killed, because his own children were young at the time.
But they know all about their grandpa.
But they do know all about him. But you think about that, if that family wasn't open with their children about what happened, then once they're gone, it wasn't on the internet, it wasn't, I mean, that story does just disappear. It's gone, and that's horrible. These
that's heartbreaking. Somebody who meant so much to your life that you will never forget their name. You don't want others to forget their name either.
No, and the interesting thing about that story is he was the Brinks armored truck driver, and his partner Harry Shank was also shot in that robbery attempt and lived. He has since passed, but his family called us.
Really?
They sent us a picture of him because he actually ends up dying years later, decades later, but as a result of the injuries he received in the shooting. Like, he had to have blood transfusions. That's right.
He was severely injured.
He was severely injured. In fact, I think, if I remember correctly, they thought he was going to die, and they weren't. They thought that George may actually make it, and it didn't work out that way. But so now that family has come to us, and said, we consider this a homicide. I mean, he died because he was shot, for no other reason.
Probably would have lived a longer life had he not been shot. That's interesting.
So those stories, and again, like, you would have never known that, and that family didn't. They really reconnected. The Schwinder family and the Shank family really reconnected after your story.
Really? And that's awesome. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That makes
so they
me feel
reached
good.
out to each other, and we've heard stories about that before. Families have a tendency to grow apart. Sometimes they live in different places. Sometimes they have falling out. Sometimes they just have different lives, and this is something that can bring them back together. And we've had families say, we hadn't talked to our cousin in 15 years, and now that this is back out in the public eye, she reached out. We're meeting up next week. We're going, and it really is heartwarming that there's something good, out of it.
If nothing else, obviously the ultimate goal is to solve the case, but if nothing else, I'm glad to hear that it does bring some families together, and it serves as a form of, I guess, therapy for some people too, because I have spoken to families that you've helped me get in touch with who have never spoken about their case publicly on TV, much less on TV.
Yeah.
So it was sort of realization that they can do it, that they have the strength to do it.
They are. And, a lot of times, especially with a cold case, like, these families, they do feel like their loved one's forgotten, and so it's like they don't forget about them, and sometimes their friends, their coworkers, their neighbors, they're fearful to bring up the victim's name because they don't want to upset, the person left behind. But what they don't understand is that person wants to talk about their loved one. They want to make sure that somebody remembers them. And so you've seen it, firsthand, that you ask, again, editing these stories is the hard part because you get them talking and they want to share all kinds of stuff about their loved one.
Which is why we created the podcast too, because unfortunately I can't put a 6-minute long piece on the news.
Yeah.
It's difficult. I mean, that's not our format. But the podcast, I can put the entire interview there, and you can listen to everything that the family had to say.
And those podcasts, some of them were over an hour long because it was the entire family's interview.
Right.
The entire interview with the detective.
No editing. You even hear me rustling through papers. Right. Like, it's just straight through.
Yeah. It was.
I was going to, and you know what, one of the things that I get asked to, sometimes I get emails and they say, why can't you put this story on the news? Or why can't you put this case on the news? I mean, if it were up to me, I'd put all the cold cases, you know what I mean? But there's a process, and that's something I guess for our viewers to know is that it's great that we get information on cases, but just that one email on this is my loved one's case, this is when it happened, that doesn't mean it's going to automatically go on the news. Right. We have to do our due diligence on our side. It's not that we don't believe you, it's just we need to be able to confirm certain things. We need to be able to talk to the police and say, is this case really still, is it cold?
Is it a cold case?
Right, because sometimes the cases will be active, and they still have
and we have
coming
had, law enforcement tell us, like, we'd prefer you hold off on
Correct.
on that one. We're working something, you know what I
It's not
mean?
that we don't want to air it. It's
Right.
just we don't want to jeopardize
And
the case.
we have so many that, you know, we keep a list going, you know, and if you reach out to us, your name goes, like for us,
Right.
any case that gets submitted to us that is in this viewing area goes on a list of cases
Correct.
to potentially do. But that's a really long list.
It is.
And so we go through
right?
them,
Yeah.
right, and we're trying to go through them as efficiently and quickly as we can. Again, it's not always about just pushing them out there. We want to do them justice.
Right.
You know,
Exactly.
we have a limited time frame, you know, we can do with the story, you know, so we do the best we can, taking all of those things into consideration.
Right. And we try our best to do cases that law enforcement has a good chance of being able to prosecute.
Yeah.
You know, the state
Yeah.
attorney has a good chance of being able to, and that doesn't always happen.
Right.
But it's great when we're able to help law enforcement in that sense.
Well, and it's great when they have input on that. I mean, the
Absolutely.
story is better when it's you know the law enforcement agency and the family.
Correct.
You know, and, 'cause
Everybody's
those
working
are,
together.
Those are two very different perspectives. Law enforcement is investigation in law enforcement, and what they're doing is not what the family's doing. The family's grieving. The family's looking for answers. You know,
Correct.
and to show where those two worlds collide, you know, and where they meet. That's an important part of telling these stories. And so we do try very hard to get law enforcement on board with any of these cases and make sure that they are, you know, able to put in their perspective, because it is important. And again,
Right.
you know, unfortunately, we've had situations where a family has given us information that wasn't accurate, and then you call up law enforcement
Correct.
and they say, well, you know,
And it
that
turns
wasn't
out-
a homicide. It was
Correct.
a murder.
We had a
It was-
case where we were very sure that it was an unsolved homicide, and it turns out that it was not ruled a homicide.
Right.
We ended up doing the story anyway and explaining why it was not a homicide, and saying this case actually got solved because XYZ, because we had invested so much time already
Yeah.
interviewing the you know, the family members, and at the same time, you know, this is a family who's grieving, you know what I mean?
Right.
And to them, in their heart, they believe one thing, but the
Right.
reality is that something else happened, and it's very difficult. I made that phone call and I said, I am so sorry, but I'm gonna have to say this in
Well,
the story,
and-
otherwise I'm not gonna be, you know,
right.
honest.
And you're not being honest.
Yeah.
Well, and that situation, part of it was, you know, sometimes the family hadn't been kept in the loop.
Correct.
on
And sometimes
some stuff
it wasn't their
too.
fault in
Yeah.
some cases where they just didn't know.
And you know, these are the things though that we deal with, that you deal with, that you know are behind the scenes, that
Correct.
typically people don't know and understand. And
That's a huge burden,
And
for
we
us.
get a lot of families that have cases that are undetermined deaths. You know, it's the medical examiner is not quite willing to say it was a homicide. Because it could have been a suicide or it could have been accidental, but there's just something about it that's not quite right,
Right.
so they won't determine which way it is.
And it's difficult for us to cover a case
And
like
we
that.
can't. I
And
mean,
if
we
do a
don't
case-
investigate.
Right.
So it's, you know, unless there's some
Right.
really specific,
Right.
you know, weirdness going on.
Absolutely, and if we do ever cover a case like that, then we have to say that. We have to say
Right.
the medical, you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
and also we get the same kind of situation. I'm sure you do as well with missing persons.
Yeah,
That's a difficult one.
that's a very slippery slope. I mean, with missing persons, you know, it's not illegal for an adult to just pick up and leave
Pick up
if
and leave,
they
right,
want,
right.
you know, and
If
it
the-
has happened,
Right,
you know,
absolutely,
and-
absolutely.
And sometimes the family that's left behind is left with all those questions, and you know, again,
If there are
that's-
signs of foul play, maybe there was a struggle, maybe their car was found somewhere, then you know that we take into consideration. But
right, exactly.
You know,
but I saw a story recently. I wish I could remember it, but it was like, you know, missing persons case, and it wasn't locally, but then they were like I think the sheriff's office maybe shared, you know, a sketch or a picture of a woman who was missing, and then it was like, never mind, we found her in California. She was fine. She just
wanted to move to California.
Wanted to move to California and didn't really want to have any connections, you know, back at home.
And you gotta just leave that alone. I mean, because this person is in their right to do that. And then, of course, there are other, you know, there are missing persons cases where it's legitimately, you know, that person may very well be deceased and maybe not by
At
their
the hands
own.
of another,
at
yeah.
the end, right. And law enforcement will say, this person, we believe this person was killed.
They typically will say that we believe foul play is suspected in that case. And sometimes I've seen it where they believe foul play is suspected, but they have zero evidence of that.
Correct.
So they won't. Their hunch, yeah. So they won't say that. They won't come out publicly and say foul play, but they believe it's foul play, and that's a tough spot. One of the things I wanted to talk about before we close out is cold cases are very popular in the media right now. I mean, there's a whole network on Investigation Discovery dedicated to true crime
and podcasts
and podcasts, and it's a huge thing. And we recognize that, and we, as an organization, Project Cold Case, we want to for lack of a better term, take advantage of that while we can, because there's always the possibility that people get burned out on true crime, and the people that care about what we do, obviously the ones affected by murder care about what we do, but our goal is always to reach those that are unaffected, and to get them to understand what we're going through, and we need the media for that, and so, for us, and this, I am always advocating for getting the cases out there in the public eye by any means necessary, whether it's social media, whether it's the local news, the print media, a magazine, a podcast, whatever it is. For these families that are desperate for answers, I encourage them to reach out to the media and utilize that tool, which is free. I mean,
absolutely, it doesn't cost you a dime.
It doesn't cost you
anything. You've been such a great advocate for that, because nobody can tell your loved one's story better than you.
Right.
So if you have a voice and a seat at the table, it'll benefit your loved one's story.
It does, and you've sat in those interviews, and you've seen the grief, you've seen the frustration, you've seen anger, you've seen all of these emotions, the sadness, you've seen every emotion possible with a family member, and that this is real, and then you get the opportunity to do something that either hasn't been done in the past or hasn't been done since the murder happened, and that is a valuable thing to these families. We had a meeting recently with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office about some new cases, and I brought up the point because I don't want it to be overlooked that doing these stories is as much for these living families as it is for the police, for justice,
Absolutely.
For all that stuff, because if these families believe that no one cares anymore, that the police don't care, that the media doesn't care, that the public doesn't care, if they believe that, then they lose hope.
Absolutely. And it gives me chills to talk about it, because hope is such a powerful feeling, and if you lose that, then then what else are we fighting for here?
Right. So we know that not all these cases are going to get solved. Unfortunately, we know that not everyone that we put on TV is going to get solved, but we also know that what we're doing for those families and for those victims is important, and it's important enough to keep doing it.
Absolutely. And it's important for people to know that, unfortunately, there are some stories out there, some cases out there where there is somebody roaming our neighborhood who they believe they got away with murder.
Right.
That should make everybody furious.
Exactly.
And unfortunately, some people out there may not feel affected. Like you said, there are people who are unaffected, but you shouldn't be. This is somebody who could live in your neighborhood.
Exactly.
Something to think about.
This is great stuff, and I thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
And we heard about your busy days, and then when you're off on Tuesdays, you come hang out with us a lot.
I love hanging out here in the Project Cold Case office.
Well,
it's like my second home.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate all that you do for us and for these families, and we recognize the importance and wanted to give just a little glimpse into your perspective, because you're always telling everybody else's stories, but it's difficult to tell those stories. And I know there's times where you have more that you want to put in and you just can't.
And a lot of times, not to, I don't ever want people to think, feel sympathy. Not that I need people to feel sympathy for me, because I am covering these stories and I feel sympathy for the families. But I do want people to know that I'm listening to your stories, and they do affect me too.
They do.
Like, I take them home sometimes, and I'm just like, man, when I see how many years have passed in certain cases and families are still grieving, that's that's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And I'm human, we're all, journalists are human too. We feel
you're a
for
real
families.
person.
Yeah,
You're
absolutely. Yeah.
not a robot up there.
right, exactly. Thank you for allowing me to talk about this. I think it's really important.
It's important, and I want people to see all the perspectives and all understand that it is difficult for you to go to a door, and that balance of doing your job and getting a good story, but not being overly abrasive or pushy or invasive, that you walk that line a lot of times. And it's not, again, like we said earlier, if it were only murder cases that you had to deal with, then you could maybe adopt one single way to do it. But you're covering all kinds of stories all the time,
and sometimes on the same day.
And so, we appreciate what you do and all the hard work that goes into it. And Joel and his wife and all the camera guys and everybody at that studio.
It's a team effort for sure. It's not just me. I mean, I
have
a whole team.
Nora did the podcast, and Paige, make sure
Paige,
that
our
we
special projects manager.
Make sure that we get this stuff done. It's important, and there is a lot of moving parts, and that's why we want to do this. We want the families to know we are constantly. We have the list going, at every opportunity that comes up. Whether it's your station, another station, we do the spotlights. We're going to UNF Thursday to meet with their journalism class to do spotlights for our website. We will take advantage of every opportunity we have to make sure these stories are told and that these victims aren't forgotten.
And I work very closely with Ryan. So if you feel more comfortable reaching out to Ryan versus reaching out to a reporter, please. I mean, that's what our partnership is about.
In touch. And we always do. We typically reach out to our families and we say, we're going down the list and we've got your loved one on here. Do you want to do it?
Right.
I'm going to pass your information to Lorena so she can call you and and schedule something. You can have the interview at our office. We can do it at your house. We can meet somewhere where we try to make it as comfortable as possible. And it's worked out well for us, and we're going to continue to do it at every opportunity we have. And for the people that aren't local, find your Lorena, in your area, and look for the person that has done a few of these stories, and look for the person that's been at that station for a few years.
It's committed to the community.
It's committed to that community. And, typically the news station's website has email addresses for the reporters.
Investigative reporters are usually a good start.
Twitter
they specialize
now
on investigations.
Is a really simple way to connect with a journalist.
Where I'm always getting alerts on Twitter on my phone, and if I get a message on Twitter, it comes right up. Versus email, where I have to go into my email and see. And sort through. So
if you're out of this area, find your Lorena and reach out and see if they're willing to do a story, and understand that they can't just do a story just because you want to do a story. There are some criteria involved. Typically, when there's a reason to do it, an anniversary or a birthday, something that they can tie it to generate more interest, they're more willing to do it.
Absolutely.
And so they're willing to do it. They just need any excuse to get it on the air. Sometimes you need
it needs to be timely. I mean, sometimes we will do something outside of an anniversary, but maybe some new evidence came to light or something like that. So it needs to have sort of that news timeliness to it, because at the end of the day, the word new is in news, and we need to be able to show people something fresh and but bring it up to date as well. Bring the stories up to date as well, and bring them information maybe they haven't heard about yet.
Exactly. A lot of these cases are cold because somebody out there has the information and is not willing to come forward.
Exactly.
Or wasn't willing to come forward in the past, and maybe that's changed. And the only way to reach them is to get the story out there. And
Absolutely.
That's what you do. So. Well, thank you so much for joining us again this week. We'll see you in a couple weeks for sure.
Yes.
And we're going to do another one of these with hopefully with somebody from the print media, and kind of give their perspective, because that's a different world.
It's a whole different news cycle.
And
news. The lingo is, we have different deadlines basically, for print and for TV.
So we're going to try to do these as kind of a media showcase where we help families and with other ways of communicating, getting their loved one's story out there. So thanks for joining us. Share this, like it, tune in next Tuesday, and we'll see what new information we have to talk about then. Thanks a lot. See you soon.
Bye-bye.